Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this latest CUCSA chat, which is the Latinx Staff Leadership Panel. Appreciate that y'all are taking some time to join us for what I think is a really important conversation. And before we go too deeply into things, let's talk a little bit about some logistics. But first, who am I? My name is Dennis McIver. I am the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Program Manager out of UC Office of the President. I'm also chair of the Council of UC Staff Assemblies. I previously served as president of UCR Staff Assembly and chair of UCR's Black Faculty and Staff Association, and I'm very excited to be able to have this discussion with all of you. Now, before we get into it, I did want to quickly read off the land acknowledgement that we've been using this year. And so we'll go ahead and jump into that. The Council of UC Staff Assemblies recognizes that our service occurs on the unceded territory of the indigenous peoples of California, and that these lands were and continue to be of great importance to them. Every member of our community has and continues to benefit from the use and stewardship of these lands. With respect and gratitude, we acknowledge and make visible our relationship to the original caretakers. We've also placed a few different websites below that we think are important to use as we talk about the indigenous history of our state. So for a little bit of quick background, we had a really positive CUCSA chat back in February around Black staff leadership. And one of the follow-up discussions is, can we do more in the spirit of looking at all sorts of different staff leaders? And I thought that was a terrific idea. And I was fortunate enough to know a number of wonderful Latinx staff leaders. And fortunately, they agreed to join me for this conversation. And so here we are. Before we jump into the introductions, just a quick note on Zoom etiquette. I know we've been doing this for a while. We are recording this for future use. So if you can't catch it now, it'll be around on the YouTube later. We do ask that you leave your microphone muted during the event. And during this event, we do have some questions, but if you would like to ask one, please feel free to use chat or make use of the raise hand function. So in this note, let me talk to you some about the amazing staff leaders that I've mentioned, and we have a doozy today. So I want to start, I did it alphabetically, just to be clear, but I wanted to start by welcoming Dr. Ed Abeyta, who serves as Associate Dean of Community Engagement and Pre-College Programs at UC San Diego Extension. And when it comes to his service, from 2008 to 2010, he served as the fifth UC staff advisor to the Regents. And then from 2000 to 2002, he also served on the Council of UC Staff Assemblies. He has a very long and distinguished service record that has also been recognized by UC San Diego, as he is a 2020 Excellence in Stewardship Award recipient there. So welcome, Dr. Ed. Up next, I'd like to note Lupe Gallegos-Diaz, who serves as the director of the Chicanx Latinx Student Development Office at UC Berkeley, with more than 30 years of service on campus. She was instrumental in establishing UC's Chicano Latino Alumni Association, and also is very active with Berkeley Staff Assembly. For this combined service, she was named a 2022 recipient of CUCSA's Kevin McCauley Memorial Outstanding Award. And up next would be Juliann Martinez, who was very recently named the Interim Executive Director of System-Wide Employee Relations at UC Office of the President. So round of applause. Let's see those emojis. There you go. And from 2009 to 2011, she served as the sixth UC staff advisor to the Regents. During her tenure across the University of California, she's been very active with multiple staff associations, including Berkeley Staff Assembly, UCOP Staff Assembly, and most recently, UCOP's Latinx Staff Association, aka LASA. And she's also been very instrumental in supporting the system-wide work of the Council of UC Staff Assemblies. And last and certainly not least would be Crystal Petrini, who serves as the Financial and Administrative Officer for the Departments of English and Philosophy, and for the moment, the Department of Black Study at UC Riverside. She is also the current immediate past chair of the Council of UC Staff Assemblies. Prior to this, she held multiple roles in UCR Staff Assembly, most recently as president during the 2019-2020 term. So welcome to our panelists. We'll go ahead and stop share. Now, we do have a series of questions that I wanted to go ahead and jump into. And we do have this list, but if you have any that do come to mind, please feel free to drop them in chat. This is really meant to be a discussion. So let's start with the first one. What is a leader to you? And I want to start with Juliann.
Thank you, Dennis. Thanks to everyone for being here today. This is it's certainly an honor to be a part of this group. I think when I think about a leader, to me, it's someone who listens and takes in the things around them, listens to the people around them, and then this may sound counterintuitive, but also someone who takes risks, who's willing to, go out there and do something, even knowing that it might not always work out. But I mean, I think sometimes we need to just jump in there and take some risks. And so I think that's what part of leadership means to me.
Thank you very much. We'll pass it over to Ed.
Well, I think I'll just co-sign what Juliann said in those terms. And also, again, thank you for the invite to join me today. This is just a special moment to come back to a family of CUCSA. I think when we look at leadership, there's a kind of a principle that I think is my mantra for us and for me, and that is putting cause before self. I think a good example of cause before self is came from UCLA, and an example with John Wooden, and when he used to talk about the MBA. It's not the NBA, but the MBA, and he used to talk about the mop and bucket attitude, and that meant that if something needed to be done, get out there and do it for the greater cause. So if the floor was dirty, it wasn't just the staff or someone on the sidelines. The responsibility is to see a need and take action to resolve it. So cause before self, along with what Juliann has noted already, are some of the tenets, I think, of a leader.
Thank you. Go ahead, Crystal.
Well, I mean, I don't have much to add. I think Juliann and Ed really covered what I was going to say, that, I think for me, leadership is really separate from any official position that you hold, right? And just being able to, from wherever you sit in an organization or in your family or in your community, being able to see what is the cause, what is the need, where are the gaps, and what can you do as an individual to start to fill that, or make some sort of change that's going to address that need, and really just keeping the focus again on the community and the larger picture, instead of yourself. So, but taking those risks, because I think there's always a risk in doing something and trying to address something. There's a reason that there's a problem, right? And usually it's intentional. And so you taking that lead to start to address it comes with some inherent risks, and having the courage to do that, I think, is a lot of the qualities that make a leader.
Great. Thank you very much. And we'll go ahead and, Crystal, as long as you're here, we might as well bring you in for another question. So this is the next question for you and Ed, and here it is. Who / and or what inspired you to lead in the UC? And we'll start with you and then go to Ed.
Well, I think for me in general, I think I've always been very community driven and very community oriented, right? So service has always been a core value of mine, in terms of how my family values are, my faith, everything else. It's like, how do I serve the people who are around me? And in terms of coming to the UC, I was a college student here. I went to UC Santa Barbara. I took advantage of a lot of the things that the UC offered. I was a resident advisor. I studied abroad for a year. I danced in ballet folklorico. I did all of these kinds of things that the university offered me. And I was like, what an amazing place to really feel like I truly belonged. And, I grew up in a very predominantly white, city area, very rural. And so my experience when I went to college was like, oh my gosh, I can be with so many other Latinos like me who care about education, who care about making a change, who want to serve back our community. And I just felt this belonging that I had really never encountered in growing up. I was always so different from my peers, and it was very obvious, and it was called out very frequently. And so going to college gave me this safe space, and I wanted to come back to the UC because, again, I wanted to serve my community, and I wanted to give back in the same sort of ways that I had been given to as a student at the university. So I came back to UC, and I left Santa Barbara because it's very expensive to live there. People will tell you that. So ended up coming back to the IE where I grew up, and just decided, okay, I'm going to start applying for any job I can at UC Riverside, and finally got back into the campus. And even though I was glad to have a stable job and to have a good income and benefits, there was still this part of me that felt like there were things that were being unfulfilled, right? Like there was a piece of me that wanted to do more, wanted to fix more, address more, help people more than just those that are in my current department. And so that's when I started to really get involved in staff assembly and just start dipping my feet, bringing love to parts of the campus that don't get a lot of love, to facilities, overnight custodial service workers and things like that. I would be there at the end of their shift at 5:30 in the morning with food for them, to be able to show them that people do care and that we recognize them, and we recognize that the value they provide to us, even if they can't come to a noon luncheon meeting, things like that. So that was kind of that direct tie to the way I feel about serving in general, just in the deepest part of my spirit. I was able to start really being able to blend those personal passions of mine with an opportunity outside of my paid job at the university. And, ever since there, I never looked back. I've been in leadership positions, I think 7 years now, and it's a lot of work, but it fulfills, like I said, that piece of me of wanting to do more and having a greater impact. And, there's just no price tag that you could ever put on that.
Well, thank you, Crystal. What do you say, Ed?
Well, my affinity for the University of California came at a young age. I grew up in New Mexico, and my father worked at a place called the Los Alamos National Laboratories. And in those labs, the UC influence, if you know the labs in New Mexico and Los Alamos, you have this amazing research facility, and right next to it, one of the poorest communities in the country, in Española. And in that moment, it was inspirational to know that you can't be what you can't see, is what Sally Ride said as an astronaut and first lady to go in space. I have an opportunity to be lucky enough to see that the influence was not in New Mexico, but it was influenced by the University of California for jobs, economic impact, and so on. And you fast forward, after graduating from the University of New Mexico, I came out and started as a senior clerk. I don't even know if they have those titles anymore, and I was working as an early academic outreach counselor. And there was a person named Linda Williams I had met at that time, who was one of our leaders, African-American leaders, that inspired me beyond belief as a woman, as a African-American leader, and a person that was having straight talk to say, we need to have more people like us and like her represent the greater leadership of our institution. And she was an inspiration not only for me to take on roles that I was not sure if I was ready, but I don't know if there's ever a time that you're ready, but except to take a step forward and lean into something that you believe into. And I watched her go from administrative assistant to a associate chancellor, and then later was the assistant to the president of the University of California, in which later on we may get into her influence on diversity, equity, and inclusion, her influence on bringing other voices to the table. Her spirit and graciousness was infectious, her smile and humor, and always the ability to be a counselor, for always looking at the brighter side of every situation and the opportunity to learn in adversity. We get stronger and move forward.
And I love the point about the value of seeing that potential in someone and telling them, because I think that does so much. Because a lot of times I also see that with folks, you have to tell them to kind of get that spark going. So you spoke to it so well. So thank you for sharing that. And for all of you out there, make sure you're telling other folks that you see that potential too, because it really does a lot. Lupe, I want to welcome you in because I know you had a portion you wanted to add to this question as well.
Yes, no, buenos dias, Lupe Gallegos-Diaz. I go by she, her, and ella, local Chicana from the Bay Area. Got most of my education around here. Yeah, no, I really like this question, Dennis, because I think for me, arriving at UC Berkeley in the late 80s, early 90s, I was a grad student in the PhD program in ethnic studies. And the two people that actually inspired me to actually see my potential of how far I can go as a leader was Dr. Margarita Melville, who was an associate dean at the university. And actually people here on the campus knew her as Santa Margarita. Because she was our blessed Santa Margarita, because we had any issues she could solve, she would solve it, she would guide us. And her and another professor at UC Davis, Ada Sosa Rydell, one of the first political sciences with a PhD, I had the opportunity and I was asked to run the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies as a grad student at that moment in my life. And I thought, oh, I don't know, this is huge. I'm only a grad student, I'm not a faculty. And I went to both of them and they both said to me, we know you can do it and we will support you financially and emotionally. And that just sparked in me. It's like, wow, these two full-time faculty, full-time community people thought I could do it. So I went for it and I was the national chair for 2 years for the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies. And that really inspired me and helped me really thrust kind of like the ability to know that I can do, that I can do what I really put my mind to. So, yeah.
Thank you for making that point, and I appreciate that mention of the emotional support too, because there's a lot of this that when it comes to leadership, there's a lot of being kind of chewed up and spit out, and so having those support points is just essential. So thank you so much for raising that point. Now, this next question is for Lupe as well as Juliann, and here it is. Can you describe the moment where you got it when it came to serving in these leadership roles? And Juliann, we'll start with you.
I was thinking about this question. I mean, I think the moment I got it was, well, there's several times, because as you're saying, there's the emotional impact. But certainly, when you're speaking in front of a group, that sort of thing. But I think I got it when really listening to staff. When as staff advisor, one of the things that we do is spend time, meeting with staff across the system, both represented and policy covered, and really trying to understand and hear about their roles across the system. And, I just, in the role of staff advisor in CUCSA or, system-wide roles, you learn so much about what is happening in the university. And I think, it just really serving in these roles, it's just like, wow, okay, the university is such an amazing place to be and to work and has so much influence in so many areas, as Ed and Crystal and Lupe have all talked about. I think to me, that's, when I just really got it, you just see the impact from people who are working, in housing and dining, in the grounds, to the labs, to supporting faculty, to, all, in administration. I mean, there's this whole gamut of jobs across the system that are just amazing. And I think, it's beautiful. It really is.
Great. Thank you for that, Julianna. It's great to see you, Juliann.
Good to see you too.
I actually will answer this in 2 parts. When I got it, I think the first part of that is because I'm the oldest of 5, there's something to say about being the first one. And people say, oh, you're bossy. And I keep saying, no, I'm disciplined. So there's a big difference and a fine line. So you can take it as it is. But I think the first part is being the oldest and also having 2 huge femtors, my mother and my aunt, who were like matriarchs in our families, that it really instilled a role modeling for me that I will never forget because it's still constantly with me. So I think that is half of the, I think the first part of that question. I think the other one is how people believe in you. So it's an earned leadership. It's a given status, which is when I teach my classes, it is given to us. And so we take it with responsibility, humility. And so I think some of the really great basic skills that I've been able to develop now in these roles is that I'm a really good listener. And that is really helpful because then you can give really good consejos, good advice, right? When you're really understanding the whole picture. And so I'm also a very creative problem solver. I might not know the answer, but I can bet you in a team, we can figure it out. So I think I'm really real creative on that as a collective leadership. And the last one that I'm really good at community building, or what I would say organizing people. So I think those three particular areas for this question is how I would answer, how I knew that between what the values that I got, the skills that I've learned, that I actually put those into practice.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing that. And this next question, I've left it open to anyone who dares to want to answer it. And the question is, each of you have had the experience of speaking to high-level leaders within the UC. And can you speak to the experience of managing up? And are there any insights that you'd be willing to share about these experiences? So this is open, so whoever wants to go first, I'll leave it to you.
Well, I think there's a gentleman approached here, so I will defer to the lady, to Hermanas here, my assistant.
I'll go first. So I think that, and I think Dennis and I have talked a lot about managing up. So this makes sense. But I think for me, managing up really just comes to having the ability to like know your audience, know what your goal is, right? And then know how to present your, like, whatever you're trying to say in a way that's both clear, concise, but also respectful and polite. And I think that as long as you keep those things, it doesn't really matter what you're saying. And I think like this is kind of the framework that I use whenever I go into any conversation, even if it's just a hard conversation with someone who's not my leader, right? But how do I make sure that you have difficult conversations or talk about subjects that might be really difficult or things that people don't want to hear in a way that they can receive them, and not only receive them in that one moment, but want to continue to receive them and want to continue to have this conversation in an ongoing sort of way, right? Because I think that that's when the real change happens, is through this kind of relationship building, and managing up is part of knowing how to build relationships, authentic and relationships that have a lot of trust. And I think with that, you're able to, again, engage in subjects or conversations that might usually be, going back to the courage that we talked about earlier, also managing your own emotions, but being able to manage them in a way where you can still be away. And I'm sorry if I lost any of you.
We got the spirit of it, so it's okay. Would anyone else like to add any portions? Because I think the trust and the relationships and having a comeback from those conversations is important. But if there's anything else that anyone else would like to add, I'd welcome it.
Well, I think what I would add to, not add, but just sort of reemphasize what Crystal said, is the building relationships and trust, in terms of managing up, it's huge. And because then you can go back and have those, if you have to have hard conversations, or you can go back again and talk to them about other issues that have come up. I think the other thing, about insights is, sometimes you need to stand your ground, having that courage that we talked about, and I mentioned earlier, even if you're not sure, taking that risk, standing there and saying what you need to say, being prepared and respectful and professional, as Crystal has said. I think all of that is important to managing up, and having those, which could be difficult conversations.
Very good point. Thank you. Anyone else wants to add any other piece to this? Because I think this is a really good conversation.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Edwin.
Oh man, here I go. This one, interrupting you is like, I'm going to pay for it. Here we go. I just wanted to think about managing up in terms of common goals, because many times we look introspectively and think about what we need as opposed to what the greater good needs. And so to the aforementioned that we said, I would just note that highlighting and managing up to solve pain points that are common to all of us, and then strengthens the overall motivation for coming together as one. And so as we look at the other pieces that Juliann and Crystal have talked about, I'd also note that advancing with someone on pain points or causes that are common among managing up or those leaders above us, especially for some of the young leaders that are on this call and others that are leading in their positions, finding common ground in common areas to work together is stronger together as opposed to going it alone.
Mhm. Great. I would just add to all my colleagues, I think Edward, you said it. I would have put what are the wins for the collective, so that even within the disagreements, there's wins for everybody and some common ground. But I would add to that also that we need common definitions, because we assume always what equity means. We assume what we're doing with other definitions. And I found it very productive within the groups that I work with, that constantly that I'm learning at the same time we're all learning what the definitions we're all discussing. And most of the time we're not on the same page. So going through that dialogue is so super important, so that everybody moves together, even though we don't have the same outcomes in the end. So.
Very, very important points. Thank you all for making the time to add your thoughts. And this next question is going to be for Lupe as well as Crystal. And it is, as staff leaders of color, can you speak to the presence of microaggressions in the time you've been a leader at UC?
I'll let Crystal go first.
Oh no, I was waiting to hear what Lupe had to say.
All right, I can go if you want to.
Yes, please do. I would love to hear you first.
I think this particular one about microaggressions, and sometimes they're not just microaggressions, they're macroaggressions. So I can say both I would include in this. I think living in an abled body as a Latina, short, you're not very skinny, I mean, there's all these kind of perceptions and assumptions to us as women of color, particularly Latinas, all the way from when I was a grad student as a graduate student instructor, and people didn't acknowledge that I was a student instructor walking in a room and people saying, where is the graduate student instructor? Kind of that invisibility. And sometimes I don't think people are malintended most of the time, but the impact on that comes down really hard about what people's perceptions of authority are, people's perceptions of who makes the decisions. The other one is even as a staff about the ability of me having expertise, knowledge, and that people don't assume that I don't have it because I might look young or I might not, I don't look older or whatever the reasons are. But I think the other one is, the perceptions, how people perceive me. And I would say even now as a staff member after 30 years, I still get some microaggressions about we can't do that. And so, but sometimes I wonder why the beginning sentence is we can't versus, hey, well, let me look into it. Let's work as a team. So part of me for these microaggressions, I think some of them, I would give you a real concrete. I learned by examples, and I'm also a very visual learner. So it's that, one of the topics that we did at BSA was bring up the inequities around parking and transportation. And we've been talking, I'm assuming this in your campuses, around the inequities for our custodial staff. There is a bunch of parking in the evenings. And one of our concerns is they're the lowest paid. And so why can't we have a dialogue about equities around people's salaries and people maybe earning the less to actually either have free or partial parking prices? And so when people keep telling me, no, you can't bring, this is not an issue you should bring up, it's not going to happen. To me, that's a microaggression also, because it's telling me, you're constantly kind of telling me as an institution and individuals who believe in those no, it's been the tradition, it's the way it is versus what we can actually create as a collective to transform the systemic inequities on these campuses. So.
Wow, amazing response, Lupe. I'm glad you went first. And my internet is unstable again, so let's see how this goes. But I would say that I think, the presence of microaggressions, like to Lupe's point, there are aggressions, period, right? Micro, macro, and they don't really have a place. But I think that I wouldn't say, well, I guess it's in the time that I've led, but I think just as a person of color, you exist in a way that it could happen anywhere, right? Regardless of your position, regardless of where you are, it just depending on who's interacting with you and their perceptions that they hold, or, their own experiences that now they're putting on you because of however they are perceiving you. But I think Lupe's point about, the staff kind of microaggressions is interesting, because I think that even outside of being people of color, right, our positionality creates kind of this sort of aggression in a lot of our roles and in a lot of our conversations, because we are looked at as not being as educated or not as intelligent as the faculty, or not as experts, right? And I frequently have discussions with my faculty about how they are the experts in the curriculum and in the classes and in the teaching, but I am the expert in all of the financials and how we administrate the departments, and how we do all of those things. And we have that sort of relationship. And so I try to model to kind of prevent these other sort of aggressions from happening, so that my colleagues can learn that it's about having these expectations dialogue, so that you can push back against being perceived as someone who doesn't have the expertise or the intelligence to be a leader, right? Or to oversee so many different things. So I think that also does connect to me in a way to being a person of color, especially because the institution itself of the university, right, was built where faculty were predominantly white men and the staff were predominantly women and people of color, and right there you already have kind of this hierarchy that's built in under the facade of positionality, but really has, I think, underlinings of systemic racism and, just overall societal, colonialism and all of the impacts of that. And so I think that, as a person, I try to approach these things with curiosity. Oh, could you tell me more about why you made that comment? Could you explain more about why you think that way? So that you're approaching it in a way that you're coming at it with curiosity, so it's not a direct blame, and you can either give them the opportunity to change what they said, or at least it gives them the opportunity to stop and think about what they've said and prevent them, hopefully, from doing that to somebody else in the future, right? But I think it's just something that you deal with in all facets of your life as a person of color, especially when you add other things like Lupe was saying, color, even language, all of these things have impacts on how people perceive you. And it's just a matter of really knowing who you are and being strong in that and pushing back against it whenever you can encounter it.
And as a witness to this, I can say Crystal has done that. I've seen it. So, and it's always turned out well because of the level of thoughtfulness through which she approaches it. So just a big up to Crystal. So we'll go over to another question. This one will be for Ed and Juliann. And this centering it on the staff experience. We know that can go unseen a lot of times. And I was hoping that you could describe an event where you helped someone in the UC get it when it comes to the staff experience. Now, that could be a regent or a senior leader or faculty member, however you want to take it. But we'll start with Juliann.
I was kind of hoping you start with Ed. Well, I think thinking back on that one, one of the times both Ed and I worked on the very first time when the Regents were looking at changing retirement. And I'll use that as an example. And I think I distinctly remember a conversation with the provost at the time where we were stepping out of a meeting and he pulled me aside and, he sits down in a chair and he says, well, I think he was asking me questions and he was really trying to take it in what we were trying to say about what it would mean if we started changing the retirement program. And I think he really got it. And in order to do that, to get him to that place, and I don't know if Ed remembers this, but we spent so much time just telling stories, telling the staff story, and for everyone, telling the stories of staff, what it would mean, and what these changes would mean, and not, trying to hit anyone over the head or badger anyone, but really just telling the story of what this means for people in a real concrete way. And I think I distinctly remember that conversation where it just seemed to hit him, and he needed to stop and he needed to have a conversation about it. So that's one example that I remember pretty clearly.
I'll jump in and just say it was 2008.
Yeah.
Take you back in the collaboration with CUCSA and our previous staff advisor and others. It was a new role at the time. And at that time, we were educating up about not having staff at the table means that you don't have the whole family representing a perspective. You can imagine on the first initial launch of the staff advisor led by David Miller and other Bill Johansson and other great leaders of CUCSA. We had actually had 2 seats at the table, and we had actually been able to have establishing a platform of normalcy. And imagine the first year, 2008, it was the first time I was going to go in as the staff advisor, and my partner happened to be Juliann Martinez. And at the day of going into the meeting, I was informed that Juliann was going to not be allowed to sit at the table, and she should sit her in the audience with the chancellors because they just didn't see the rationale of having 2 individuals at the table to have a voice. That was our starting point for that year. And it was a starting point that we were not going to hold back, and we had to step in for all of us as staff, but most importantly for the role and the perspective of staff. Just so happens that day when we actually went in and I had the microphone, and they had decided that a new transition to an individual reporting to the president, that I was not going to be able to have the voice, nor Juliann. So an example of actually managing up, I had a great mentor with George Blumenthal as chancellor at the time, and some others over at Santa Cruz. And so what did we do? I got up, and if they wouldn't let me at the table, I put myself in the line for public comment. And it made them so damn nervous, because my message going up to the microphone is, if you can't put us at the table, then you're going to hear my voice through the public comment. And if you want to be able to say that you're about equity, it starts at the table. And by the time it was about 5 people going up, I had my laptop and remarks. It made the Regents so damn nervous, it ended up causing a timeout. They actually called the timeout in the meeting because they were afraid I was going to unleash some messages that they perhaps might not want to hear. Thankfully, that didn't happen. I was amazingly moved up to the table, and so was Juliann at that moment. And then in that moment, our voices started to be heard, and the role of staff advisor moved forward. And with the courage and balance of Juliann at that time, I would also say in our leadership, it takes a great partner, whether a partner in life, partner at work. Juliann, there's moments where I had to tell her, I love you, man. I'm going to go for it. Please try to clean up. And that kind of ended up the story. The disruption that year was one step of creating a disturbance, but the loveliness of having the personality of Juliann with her tone, with her empathy to soften it, was teamwork united of making a change and taking a risk.
Thank you, Ed. I appreciate that. But I think and I remember that, but one thing I want to highlight that for everyone is what Ed is saying about partnership, and leaning into community. And Lupe and Crystal, we've all mentioned this, but leaning into community and finding those people, and just leaning on them. I mean, I think that has helped me so many times, where I'm, you could be lost or you're not sure about the next step, but leaning in, onto your partner, like, Ed and I did, and he was sometimes willing to take more risks than I was. But leaning on those people around you to help move things forward and to do that and to be of service. I think that's just huge.
And to that point, I would say that I've been, even in my capacity, I've been very grateful for the community I've seen of staff leaders that's emerged, everything from our past CUCSA chairs to a couple of names that we've heard today and past staff advisors, even to more recent ones like Lucy Singh out of UCLA or Priya Lakareddy. They've being able to have that community of folks to kind of support and work with each other really is essential when it comes to this type of work and managing up. And so thank you all for raising that point. We're going to shake things up a little bit because I do see lunches approaching and I do not want to get in the way of anyone eating and taking a break. So I'm going to jump towards the end of our questions list. And this is a question for all of you. And the question is, what is the biggest change you saw in yourself as a leader? And this time we will start with Ed. So go ahead.
Oh, geez. I got to say the biggest change I saw in myself was that I gained weight during my period during a period of time. I'll facetiously say that the changes that I realized is that you never know what you're capable of doing until you put yourself out there. And sometimes the expectations of failure and any other mind set or thought process that puts you in a place of fear, puts you in a place of risk. What I realized through the experience through 2008 and 10, never underestimate the power of your voice, leading with love, empathy, understanding the greater community, and knowing that your voice can actually be a catalyst for change. And for my voice, it was refined in a sense that it enabled me to speak in a different way, that enabled to have a broader view, and realizing that there is moments that you have in life. And in those moments, you have to be able to take the risk to know that this is a moment not lost. And if it's not you, the question is who? So the question for me is never miss a moment.
That's heavy. I had to take a moment, but that's great. Thank you for sharing that. Lupe, we'll jump over to you. What's the biggest change you've seen in yourself? You're muted, just as a heads up.
Oh, sorry. So I think for me, I've learned over the years now, and a lot of it is because I've learned how to be very reflective. And reflective in the sense for me, it's about writing and reading, because I need to slow down, because most leaders are tending to go 10,000 miles an hour. And so part of it is leading from anywhere, that no matter where I'm positioned, I can actually lead. And that's important because anybody on the university could lead. And I think people need to understand that leadership is everywhere. We just need to cultivate those leadership skills. But also, I really like what Edward said, is leading from the heart. I have found that Laura Rendon's book on Senti Pensate, where she talks about higher ed being very head heavy, and that higher ed has lost its way, and that we need to be really holistic and bring the heart and the body with our head together so that it's holistic. And so I really constantly walk now thinking, am I collectively wholly connected to my head, my heart, and my body as I'm moving through the work that I'm doing? And that includes some of those values that Ed talked about, being have humility, have respect, have a foresight to be able to step back. So that would be kind of what I'm still learning in this journey to leadership. Mm-hmm.
And thank you very much for sharing that. And Juliann, what do you have to add?
I think Ed and Lupe really hit on it. I mean, I think a lot of it is, for myself, really, trusting myself and knowing, like we sort of started this conversation, taking that risk, stepping out, maybe not knowing all the answers, leaning on, community and the people around you, and, being willing to hear the hard stuff. I mean, sometimes the people who have taught me the most are the people who have really pushed me and said, you can do this, or why did you do that? People who ask you those questions. But I think, those are some of the things I've learned, but really, leaning on community, leaning on the people around you, and learning from everyone, I think is super important. And I love what Lupe said about, you know, the heart and the head. You know, that's so true. You know, I don't think we do it often enough.
I agree for what it's worth. And Crystal, I'll give you the last word on this.
I think mine, I'm going to change your question a little bit because, you know, I do those things. And I agree, because I agree wholeheartedly with, you know, what Juliann and Lupe and Ed have all said, in terms of the way you change through these leadership. And I've experienced all of the things that they've talked about. But I think for me, what I've really started to be reflecting on is that I've always been this person, right? So like, I think we always think you have to become a leader. Like there's something that happens in you that like transforms you and now you become this person. But I mean, when I was in 4th grade, we all sat around and we had the class rules that we were going to have. And, you know, it was like, you know, typical 4th grade class, like, okay, what are our rules going to be? And one of the rules that one of the students said was no Spanish allowed in the classroom. And of course, you know, me being the daughter of an immigrant, of the teacher who's the head of the bilingual program and all of these things, I was like, oh, heck no, like that can't be. And it was like, well, you know, majority of the class voted on it. So, and of course, the majority of the class is non-Spanish speaking white. And so my mom found me later that afternoon and I was making signs in her classroom when she found me. She's like, what are you making signs for? And I'm like, oh, we're having a protest tomorrow because, you know, the teacher said that now we can't speak Spanish in the classroom and that just cannot be, you know, like, so we're going to do this. And my mom's like, you don't need to have a protest. I'll go talk to the teacher, because she was a teacher at the school too. But, you know, I think I just show this to demonstrate that, you know, even when we're so young and, you know, when we feel like we don't have any sort of power, it's like, I knew from being a very little kid, from watching the people in my community, from watching the very strong women in my family, especially, that we can make a change. It's just a matter of having that common cause that we're all fighting for, something that's just not right, that we can all kind of get on board with, and that so many people can come together to resolve. And I've done that several times throughout my life. I staged a walkout in high school during the immigration riots. You know, I've done these things over and over again. So even though my context has changed and maybe my causes have changed depending on what's needed in the time, I think, you know, at the end of the day, it's like, I am a person who wants to serve my community, who wants to make people feel like they belong and like they're protected, and that someone is looking out for them, even if it's someone like me who doesn't have like this official positionality. I'm still going to go out there. I'm still going to have the courage. I'm still going to take risks, because I know that there's a lot of people who cannot afford those risks. And I have a privilege where I can, and I will do that for them. And so even though it's not necessarily a change, I've just done a lot of reflection on, like, you know, really sticking to your core values and being who you are and being proud of all of the pieces of you and being able to be all of those pieces, even in an environment that sometimes tells us that we can't bring all of our pieces to work, right? Or to the university, and really pushing against that and showing how beautiful it can be when we bring all of those things together.
Really amazing and powerful note to end the conversation on. So thank y'all for your candor on your experiences with this. But more than that, thank you for the leadership and the examples that you've shown in and out of UC. And I will tell you, this particular group of leaders continues to do this work. And so I'm going to share a couple of links for everyone as we close out. The first one is an announcement that just came out earlier this week at UC San Diego. So I want to acknowledge and congratulate Ed, because I know he was played a prominent role in this happening. So I encourage everyone to look that up and share the news. As we close, because I have to plug, that's what I've learned to do, and I've made my peace with it. I want to share a couple of other opportunities you can have to just stay engaged here as it relates to CUCSA. So the first one is going to happen May 25th, and it relates to strategic planning for staff organizations, because a lot of times we look at this through the lens of, oh, for organizations and for businesses, but for staff groups, I think strategic planning is an overlooked and essential element. So CUCSA, we decided we're going to get the word out. So I encourage you to share the word if you're interested in things like strategic planning within your own circles and within your staff organizations. You can register. It's free. Everything we do is free. So encourage you to check that out. And then also on June 27th, and consistent with our mid-year check-in in January, The leadership of CUCSA, as well as AMP, as well as the staff advisor to the Regents, is going to have a closing conversation, calling it the exit interview. And it's just a chance to talk about the experience and the work over the last year, and also serve as a bridge into the next term of leadership. So I encourage everyone to check that out, just to hear about what's been happening system-wide as it relates to staff leadership, because work is happening for you, and we want to make sure that you're aware of it. So make sure to check that out. The last thing I'll share, if you want to learn more about CUCSA and the work we're doing, please go to that bit.ly link. It'll redirect you to our link tree. We have every type of social media you can think of. And if there are things you're interested in, please feel free to communicate with us. We have all of our communications channels there. So on that note, going to send everyone to lunch at noon. Thank you so much to our wonderful panel. This is recorded. Share it with your friends when it goes on our YouTube page. But otherwise, everyone have a wonderful rest of the week, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invite.